Hi guys, welcome back to Battle with Ola. This is Mujola Oluwa. That's where the Ola is from, and I'm super thrilled to welcome you to this episode of Battle with Ola, where I'll be talking about my LLM journey, especially my thesis. I have just completed my LLM at Liverpool John Moores University, UK. If you've been following my channel from my journey since I started in 2020, you would know that I had a few admissions in 2020, some or most of which I did not use, but I detailed how I applied. I shared my application essay on the channel. I even explained how to put an application together if you wanted to pursue an LLM or a graduate degree in a foreign country. So you should look out for those on the channel. It is also something I offer as a service. I don't create people's documents from scratch, but I help them review what they have put together, which is a recommended option by admissions committee the world over, so that they can tally it with the requirements of the admission committee and improve their chances at getting a slot in their graduate program in the graduate program of their choice or of their dreams. So I have just completed my LLM and I wrote my thesis in international law of conflict and warfare. It's an area of law that I fell in love with while doing my LLM. I took a module that is also titled eponymously International Law of Conflict and Warfare. And that's when I was first introduced to the concept of humanitarian intervention. So when it was time for me to write my thesis, I decided to write my thesis on that area. Having written a paper, during the program in that aspect already, I decided to expand on it and to also focus, expand and zero in. So essentially, I wrote about the United Nations humanitarian intervention in Libya in 2011, looking at the legal aspect, its implications for sovereignty, and how the United Nations and indeed the international community should approach the subject or concept of humanitarian intervention going forward. And so my topic is, or was, balancing the competing interests of humanitarian intervention and state sovereignty, lessons from Libya. I particularly enjoyed writing on this topic because I chose the topic myself. I had the liberty, the latitude to decide what I wanted to write and how I wanted to write it. And I wrote a proposal initially. I think it was 4,500 words. That was last year, because the journey took about 7 months, after the approval of my proposal. That's the school's timeline. I could have shrunk it because I actually wrote the entire paper. If I count the scattered days and weeks, I probably wrote everything in a month or under. But the school required us to write it across that length of time. And so I completed it this year and it's been graded. I have a 70 grade, or I had a 70 grade and A grade, and I'm super elated. So I want to take you through the journey of writing my thesis. A few people have already asked me, since I've discussed or mentioned this on some platforms, about how to choose your topic, how to go about it and all of that. I hope that in this series I can just document my own experience, and as usual, it could be a guideline and it can be a guiding light, for someone looking to also write their own thesis, whether it's an LLM or in another field. So let's talk in this short series about balancing the competing interests of humanitarian intervention and state sovereignty, looking at Libya, Muammar Gaddafi's Libya in Africa as our case study. To make this very easy to follow, I'm going to attempt to use the WH questions that we always use on Battle with Ola. That's the what, why, when, who, where, and how. So let's look at it. Maybe it will work. And if it doesn't, I'm just going to go on and explain, pausing the video where it may be necessary for you to jump onto the next episode. So people who often say that, oh, the video is too long, oh, this and that. Please, there are chapters and there's the skip button, the fast forward button, but I encourage you to watch everything. I know that those who seek to get value for them to implement in their own journey will not skip a minute of this, and that's why I will not waste any time, and we're going to go straight into the topic. So how did I choose my topic, or how did I write my thesis? The school gave us guidelines. It is very important for you to look at your school's guidelines. What have they said? What did they expect? So after I'd completed all the law modules for the LLM, I also had to complete a module called Advanced Legal Research. In that module, they taught us how to write a thesis. So everything we needed to know, the whole works, we were taught, and at the end of it, we had to turn in a 4,500 word proposal on the topic that we are choosing. So they gave us the latitude to write in all the areas of law that we had been taught, the modules that we'd completed. But I decided to write, I had two modules in mind: international labor law and then international law of conflict and warfare. Because I had written and published the papers that I had written under the international labor law and international law of conflict and warfare. I published them on other platforms aside from submitting them to the school. There are topics that stand out for me because writing them educated me personally, aside from educating, my readers, my audience, across the ages. So in my international labor law module, at the end of it, I had written about the ILO interventions in the workplace standards in Africa and the world generally that ensured gender equality. So that module essentially exposed us to gender equality in the workplace and how gender imbalance at home affects gender imbalance at the workspace, and what the ILO is doing, the laws and regulations. Don't forget, it's a law master's program, so everything is tied back to law. So we had looked at that and had written that paper. So I wanted to really write on something that essentially said that if we want to close the gender gap in the workplace, it has to start from the home. So I wanted to look at unpaid labor performed by women at home and how it reduces their chances and affects their career growth, and how it feeds and fosters gender inequality in the workspace and in the world at large. That's what I wanted to write about. So I was ready. I had already started the proposal. I was getting materials and all of that. Then I realized that from the body of materials that I had gathered, the resource materials now, I realized that I was going to be interrogating a lot of data, numerical data, and it was a bit too much for me. I just wasn't ready to deal with that much numerical data, mathematical data, in fact. So I switched and decided to go for international law of conflict and warfare. If I had not written this conflict and warfare paper for my thesis, I would have written it even after my program, because it is something that's so fascinating to me and that introduced me to another side of international law. So I then decided to write my paper on international law of conflict and warfare. I had written a paper where I had advocated for the implementation or the canonization of the right to humanitarian intervention. So in that paper that I wrote during the international law of conflict and warfare module, I had canvassed that since the committee or the nations of the world already believe and agree that they have a responsibility to protect one another, that is, if a state is imploding, if a state is going to ruins because its leaders, its government is going against their people, other nations cannot stand and watch. They have to come in and do something about it, especially to protect human rights and to protect lives and property and enforce and defend, the sanctity of fundamental human rights, which are inalienable. So I had said that to do that, humanitarian intervention should not just be a duty, or we should not just leave it as the responsibility to protect, but that responsibility should give rise to a right, just like every other human right. That right should now reside in the United Nations, to be exercised by all the nations of the world, for other countries or their sister or brother members that are going through an implosion domestically. So I'd written that paper. It was published in the UNILAG Law Review. UNILAG is University of Lagos Law Review. The editor had written to me in 2021 or 2022 and asked me to submit a paper to be published in the upcoming journal. So I'd rewritten that paper, readapted it a bit, and submitted it. Even though, looking at it a few weeks ago, I saw that, there's more work that could have been done on that paper. But I'm talking about it now from better light because I've written a more extensive and comprehensive paper in that direction, and so I understand some things better now. But that paper is in the Unilag Law Review. I'll leave a link to it in the description box. Please read it and let me have your comments. Let's continue the conversation in the comment section. So I decided that I wanted to expand on that thought, on the idea of canonizing the right to humanitarian intervention. So I then decided to look at an intervention that's been carried out. How was it carried out? What were the legal issues involved, and how were they resolved? What was the modus operandi of the United Nations Security Council in carrying out the humanitarian intervention in Libya? What was really happening in Libya? Was the intervention needed? Was it necessary? And now that it's been carried out, what's the aftermath? And was it in compliance with the existing law? If not, are there laws that should be put in place to ensure that in the future humanitarian interventions are lawful and lawfully carried out? So that's what I want to talk about in my paper, because this is a very controversial topic in the sense that most people jump at it from the socio-political angle, and they say things like, oh, the United Nations had ulterior motives for going into Libya. They have destroyed Libya. Look at Libya today. Libya has not recovered from that intervention and all of that, when they knew that they were not going to ensure stability, post-intervention stability. Why did they go into Libya? Why did they remove the incumbent government of Muammar Gaddafi? But that was not the focus of my paper, and that's not going to be the focus in this series. I'm just going to be talking about what my own focus was, the legal aspects, and how I set about, writing. So let's start. How did I choose my thesis topic? I've told you. So when I decided to go into humanitarian, when I decided to write about international law of conflict and warfare, I knew that I wanted to write about humanitarian intervention. So I decided this time to deviate from what I had written before a bit. I'm still writing about humanitarian intervention. I advocated for the canonization of the right before, but I want to establish the fact that, one, it is a necessity. Two, it must be done lawfully. And three, we must grade the success or the failure of an intervention against the reason why it was carried out and the modus operandi set out and approved by the United Nations Security Council for carrying it out. We must not grade it by our own perceptions and what we expected could have been done or should have been done, which is what most people, find it easier to talk about. So that's what I set out to do. Now, you should know that to write a graduate thesis, you must have a literature gap that you're trying to fill. What is that gap in literature? So when I looked, I saw that most people talk about the socio-political aspect. Most people talk about the aftermath. Most people talk about, the Western influence and how it was to take Libya's wealth, to put their own puppet there and all of that. But no, I wanted to talk about it from the legal aspect. Did the United Nations have the legal right to, through NATO, intervene in Libya? If they did, what law did they follow? What was the modus set out and approved by the council? And was that followed? That's what I wanted to look at. And then what can we learn from it for future interventions? Because we cannot rule out the possibility of future interventions. We must look out for each other as a community of nations. I don't know why I keep saying committee. As a community of nations, we must look out for each other. It is necessities laid upon us to look out for each other. But if we must do that, what are the parameters that should be on ground that we must follow so that intervening in an imploding nation is not left to the whims and caprices of the United Nations Security Council or whoever is a world power at any given time? So I looked at past interventions, then I zeroed in on the Libyan intervention itself, and then I went on from there. So that was the literature gap that I was trying to fill. So that's how I now decided that my topic would be balancing the competing interests of humanitarian intervention and sovereignty, which is a legal phenomenon. Lessons from Libya. So balancing the competing interests, because these are two poles apart. Sovereignty talks about a nation having total control over its own affairs without external interference. Humanitarian intervention essentially means external interference in the affairs of an imploding nation or a nation that is in trouble. Now, How do we balance these competing interests in a world where we cannot completely eschew, implosion domestically, like the case of Libya? What had happened was that the government had turned against its own people. The world cannot watch, because the government is supposed to be protecting the people, its own people, from the world, other countries. That's when we have world wars. That's when we have wars, international wars, wars between nations and countries. But now the government is at war with its own people. The world cannot say, because it's a sovereign state or a sovereign nation, let's watch. So that's essentially what I did. So that's how I came about my paper. I found it very interesting, and I'm also hoping to do a PhD in that area of law, in international law especially. Hopefully I get a funded slot to proceed with my education, because PhD I must do. So that's how. When I've told you that the school had us do it within 7 months, I think, as of June last year, 2023, or was it May? No, June. I think I submitted my proposal, or the results for my proposal came in June, and it was 100%. That is, no corrections at all. The supervisor of the school agreed with me that the proposal was perfect. What I set out to do, I was clear about it. I understood what I wanted to write about, and they said, go ahead and write about it, and you have till next year to submit. So essentially I had 7 months to write, and I wrote within 7 months. But I did not essentially write everything in those 7 months. What happened was that I started chapter 1, because the dissertation course was a course on its own. So it wasn't just like I was writing a thesis alone. I was also taking lessons, per chapter, how to write chapters. So these are things that are included, these are things that are not to be included. And then I was looking at the guidelines and the parameters set up by the school, and also I had to answer some questions and do some short exercises and submit, even as I was writing my thesis. Everything was, to help me write a perfect thesis. So I was doing that. So I think I wrote my chapter 1. I think I spent about a month or 2 on it. I spent more on chapter 2. I spent about 4 months on chapter 2. And then I think I wrote chapter 3 and 4 in about 1 week. Yeah, that's how it happened, So ordinarily I write a lot. I'm a writer, you should know that if you've been following the channel. So, and I write academic papers too a lot. I've been writing it for years. So, it sort of runs in my family anyways. So when I want to write, usually I could think about more about what I want to write about, research, gather material and all of that, start it. But the bulk of the writing, I usually do it in probably one sitting or a few sittings or a few days, especially if there's a deadline. So that's what really happened in my thesis. And as I was writing, I had to be submitting for my supervisor to look at it and give his comments. And I must say that the comments were so gracious. He would always say what I did right, and then he would say what he thinks I should add or remove from it, or what I should expand upon or limit, including the structure of the paper. Oh, you should use subheadings, you should do this, you should do that. It was really wonderful. It was fantastic. I really enjoyed doing my LLM, writing my thesis. It was stressful, it was tough, if I would say that, but it was worth it. So that's when. I've talked about when. I've talked about why did I want to write about this. I've talked about it, that I fell in love with it when I did my International Law of Conflict and Warfare module. I fell in love with the idea of humanitarian intervention. I think it's something important that the world needs to look at, because it is a necessity. It is not really that optional. The world cannot watch, like what Kofi Annan said. He said, should the world watch, when other nations are going through this kind of crisis? We cannot just watch and say death toll should increase because a nation is a sovereign state. They should just mind their own business while other nations mind their own business, because implosions can turn to explosions, and there could be spillover effects. When nations are imploding, we have refugees that spill over to other countries, other nations. Those nations have to plan their economy and development around those extra refugees, because they are humans and their own human rights must be respected wherever they find themselves. So nations have to accommodate them. And so it's better to help their nation get to stability, so that, you know, even if they have to leave because migration is unavoidable, it will be in comfortable terms, and it will be mutually beneficial to the nation that is receiving them and the nation that they are leaving from. You know, when some people move from one nation to another, other people move to their own nation and all of that. But if it happens that a nation is being destroyed, brought to the ground, and people are just fleeing it into other nations, it's not receiving other nations, you know, there will be an imbalance in the ecosystem somehow. So these are some of the reasons, you know, why humanitarian intervention is a necessity. It's important. It goes to the root of human existence. And there are records of situations where the world has watched as a nation went to ruins, as its government turned against its people, and the world said, oh, there is sovereign state, we don't want to interfere. And, you know, the results were not good. So the cost of watching is far graver, far serious, and far non-beneficial to any party, you know, than intervening. So these are some of the things, the reasons why I thought to write my paper in this, my thesis in this area of law. So we've talked about when, why, how, what. The what is balancing the competing interests of humanitarian intervention and state sovereignty. Lessons from Libya. I've essentially explained that. So who? Moi. Oluwapelumi Mojola Oluwa Livingstones. I'm the one that wrote the paper for my LLM thesis, and I had a swell time writing it. A tough and exerting but swell time, because I love to write. So that's who, and of course where, at Liverpool John Moores University, United Kingdom. So this is all I want to talk to you about in this video. In the next video, I'm going to be talking about my chapter 1 and probably chapter 2, so that we don't elongate the series longer than necessary. And probably we'll do a third video where I'll talk about chapter 3 and 4. Maybe a fourth video if there's any other thing to talk about, and if not, we'll just round it off. And like every other series, it will be in the playlist section. You can look for it and watch it. I did a series on mediation when I was a government mediator. When I was a prosecutor, I did a series on what it means to be a state counsel, what state counsel does, or what a state counsel does. So you should watch those series. We've done series, and we have a playlist or several playlists on different aspects of law, on tenancies, on administration of estates and wills, you know, on criminal law, on civil litigation, criminal litigation, and a host of other aspects of law. Please come along with me on this channel. Like the video, leave me comments in the comment section, tell your friends and foes about Bar Talk with Ola, share the news, and do subscribe to the channel. I will see you in my very next video. Don't forget to subscribe. Toodles.